Today, we are joined by David Duffield, who we're really happy to have with us today. David is the History Programs Coordinator at the Center on Colfax and is going to present for us today Loving Women, a History of Women Loving Women in Colorado. The Center on Colfax opened in 1976 and has grown to become the largest LGBTQ community center in the Rocky Mountain region, giving voice to Colorado's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer plus community members, and playing a pivotal role in statewide initiatives to combat harassment and discrimination in Colorado and beyond. So David, thank you so much for being here.
Kat, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Well, folks, my name is David Duffield. I am extremely happy that we're all here today. And just to let you know, a feature of our times is that sometimes people are going to bomb our chats, but that's nothing we can do about it at the moment, and we will get that resolved. Suffice it to say, this is a disturbing time that we live in. I just want to say that I give this talk in the fullest sense of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as the Center on Colfax. The center has, as Kat mentioned, been around since 1976, and though Pride this year has unfortunately been forced to be canceled, we are still offering a full gamut of online programming for Pride, which is beginning in the 20th and going throughout the rest of the month, such as our Queer Authors Expo, among others. Our talk today is going to be talking about the history of women loving women in Colorado, and if you'll bear with me, I have someone doing some yard work. We are going to be looking at the history of women loving women in Colorado and the work of the Taoiseach History Committee, of which Kat sits on, actually. We are proud to present the stories that we've gathered together over the past couple of months, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about that in the next few minutes. So Kat, if you would kindly, next slide, please. Thank you so much, my darling. When we talk about the history of women loving women in Colorado, I wanted to tell you a little bit about sort of what the Taoiseach History Committee is. As the coordinator for the Colorado LGBTQ History Project, I realized that about 6 months ago or 10 months ago, it was possible to do a new history of women loving women. And I'll explain the term women loving women as a more broad and encompassing term which affects bisexual women, lesbian women, transgender women who also love women, transgender men who also love women, and a number of others. So this can be a kind of amorphous term, but it also represents a historical term as well. The term women loving women comes from 1970s women's music and I'm going to move on just a little bit past that. Unfortunately, I can't seem to get my tongue straight today. Okay, so what I'd like you to think about is Colorado as a place where there are multiple communities. So this isn't necessarily just a history of Colorado, but a regional history of women loving women as well. When we go and we talk about the history of women loving women, what we're really talking about is the history of women of Colorado, in addition to women who happen to love those who are embodied as they as they are. When I began working on this project several years ago, there was a huge gap in the middle of the history of queer Colorado for just about World War II after to about 1960. There wasn't a lot written. There were some sources about the Denver Area Madison Society, but from the perspective of women loving women, it was a little opaque. And then a little bit before that, we had stories about women being arrested for cross-dressing, but not very many. Within the last couple of years, even within the last year, we've been able to put together probably 15 to 25 stories of women loving women, among which are the Katie Gilmartin collection that will talk about the history of women loving women in the middle of the 20th century, and I'll talk about a little bit more. So back to my own work. As I began doing this project a couple of years ago, there was this huge gap, and I realized that the the history of women loving women could be done when I discovered that Katie had done these huge oral histories in the 1990s, and that we had actually not just a few, but 35 oral histories of women loving women in Colorado between about 1940 and 1970. And that represents, to my knowledge and my research, the largest chunk of the history of women loving women in Colorado. So I created the Taoiseach History Committee, among whose members are Kat Jensen, Kathleen Ward, Abby Wold, Joanna Capps, and many others. And we started to divide our work into 3 consecutive periods: 1870 to 1920, 1920 to 1970, and 1970 to the present. And because the Gilmartin collection was the very first collection to come to our fingertips, that's the collection we've been working on most within the last 10 months. So what we've been doing as committee members is listening to them, taking notes on them, talking about themes and places, with the ultimate goal being to create the very first history of women loving women across those 3 time periods, and to really lay the foundation bedrock of the history of women loving women in Colorado, because we have these different stories across a period of time, as well as to encourage other historians to begin to explore and to create and to add to this narrative. In effect, I think that what we're really doing is creating not just the first history, but calling people to action to study the history of women loving women in Colorado, and to encourage others not simply to create that history, but to record and to preserve and to actively curate and care for these stories as well. So I'm going to begin today's talk by talking a little bit about what the nature of women loving women or what these stories were like. On your left in the slide, you'll see the story of Frenchie Vosbaugh. And then on your right, you will of course see Catherine Lee Bates. I'm going to begin with Catherine's story because it begins a little bit before Vosbaugh's story in chronological terms with the evidence that we have. Bates came to Colorado in the summer of 1893, and she was affiliated with Colorado College. She went to the top of Pikes Peak, and as the clouds were parting and the rays were casting down over the plains, she penned the poem, America the Beautiful. What few people know is that Bates was involved with a same-sex relationship with a woman named Catherine Coleman. And historians like Judith Schwartz and Lillian Faderman take this as a lesbian relationship, simply because they cared for each other, or not simply because they just cared for each other, and that's shown in their letters, but also because they inhabited the same spaces. They showed deep and abiding love for one another, and Bates never married. But also because that we know that there are women-loving women who recognize them as a couple. This is one of the greatest signifiers of women-loving women before the 1920s. The reason why we can look back in the stories and the histories to what may have been occluded at the time and identify people who may have been women-loving women. And what this means is many different things. I encourage everyone to read Lillian Faderman's book, What Lesbians Have Done for America. It's a phenomenal read, and it's enlightening to look at this period of time, to the history of lesbians and women-loving women. But one of the key factors that Faderman talks about is not just the couplehood or the recognition or the love letters, but the same-sex spaces and the intimacy. In other words, the affection that people show for each other. Affection can take on many, many forms. And while we come with the term Boston marriage or romantic partnerships in the late 19th century, what we really have are relationships that we can look back over the course of time and see if they are truly women-loving women. In fact, there may be yet a whole culture of women-loving women in 18th and 19th centuries America, all over the country, which has truly yet to be explored. So when Coleman eventually died from breast cancer, I believe around 1915, Catherine Lee Bates cared for her. And they were both professors, I believe, of English and poetry and letters in Michigan. And amongst them, and amongst these women's schools, particularly back east, which is where Faderman bases much of her study, we have great examples of what the lives of women-loving women were like. But think about what many of these women were fighting for. These elite women who had access to education, access to privilege, access to schools, access to professorships, even though they had to create their own safe spaces, their own separate schools. but they had privilege in a regard that isn't necessarily equal to all different perspectives, and not that we can truly represent all different perspectives. But Vospa's story represents something a little bit different. Vospa, Frenchie, was born in France around 1848 and came to the United States. Vospa, Frenchie lived in Missouri and then eventually settled in Trinidad, Colorado, which is significant for many different reasons. But when in 1907, Frenchie went to the hospital at an advanced age for pneumonia, it was discovered that, that Vospa was a biological woman presenting themselves as a male. And so this caused a huge ruckus. In 19th century parlance, Vospa was a so-called female husband, or a discovered female husband. There's a forthcoming book actually by that title. I encourage everyone to read Female Husbands. It's coming out in this month. Suffice it to say, Vospa represents an interesting story because here you have a, by many accounts, well-educated working-class person who had a wife, had a kid, had a loving relationship, though the wife eventually, according to the newspaper accounts, left. Vospa lived and worked as a man for the last 50 years of their life. Frenchie was a ranch hand and cooked and worked on the Blue Hand Ranch, I believe, right outside of Trinidad, Colorado. Long story short, I can't really do justice to Frenchie's story, but what we really have here is an example of of someone we would identify as a transgender man presenting but being discovered as a biological woman. Suffice it to say, what ends up happening with Frenchie is that as the nuns try to dress Frenchie in a dress, and they want to make Frenchie wear a dress in the hospital, the archbishop or the bishop of the local Catholic parish allegedly steps in and says, no, you can't do that. Eventually what we get to is a contrast between privilege and urban spaces and more working class rural spaces. Vospa seems to have been accepted as who Vospa presented themselves to be. I'll use a he pronoun, even though that's historicizing their story. When he presented himself as he felt as he was embodied, the acceptance was probably a factor of utility, right? No one really cared. No one had even if they knew, it wasn't really a big deal. It's just how that person chose to live their life. It was no difference than someone being a next door neighbor of a different race or class. And yet when we look at Coleman's story and Bates' story, they had lived in and around major cities, they worked in and around major universities, and while their profile is higher, this is one of the differences in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that we can see in the broad narratives of women loving women, that privilege seemed to create more scrutiny, and not having and being working class didn't really seem to do as much. So it also seems to be a matter of utility, right? People tended to go after folks who had whose privilege could could be exposed. But then again, privilege was also a double-edged sword, right? It might have offered some protection, of which Federman talks about them really loving the idea that they could have this privilege and they could have their separate lives and no one would really bother them. And yet, for working class people, when they gender transgress, the anti-cross-dressing laws, which I'll talk about in a moment, like Frenchie Vospa allegedly did, even though that didn't exist in Trinidad, or when they were involved in same-sex affairs and it became more and more pathologized as time went on, or when they were involved in same-sex affairs and lost family. These are kind of the harm narratives that we see within the history of women loving women all throughout the three different periods. In other words, authority and state was harder on people who transgressed, who had families, and who were viewed as wards of the state. So when we're looking at some of these stories, and my dear Kat, if you can please go to the next slide, I would appreciate it. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. We want to look at one major concept. In the late 19th century, and actually in the middle of the 19th century, most American cities had, and most American states had anti-cross-dressing laws. What this meant was that people could not present themselves in, quote, a dress not belonging to their sex in the vast majority of American cities. And this was a function, or at least used applicably from William Eskridge's Gay Law and several of his other books, as well as Claire Sayre's work on the subject, talking about the history of anti-cross-dressing laws in San Francisco called arresting dress, to target by elite power holders, for instance, mayors, newspaper editors, to target gender nonconforming people. More often than not, this fell on the queer community. And what that means is that it was also used to target sex workers. So what they would do is they would get the story of an arrest for a local crossdresser. They would run it in the news. They would say, there's a problem. This person's a psychopath, or this person is different, or this person is a ward of the state, as Emily Skidmore talks about in her book, True Sex. And when that happened, they would raise up public ire, they would sell more news, and it became this ever-growing cycle of gender nonconforming people and anti-cross-dressing laws and queer people becoming stigma of public scrutiny. So while people like Catherine Lee Bates and Catherine Coleman perhaps had the privilege to maybe hide a little bit more, people like Frenchie Vospa or people like Grace Evangeliste, who we'll talk about in a few minutes, didn't necessarily share that same level of privilege. And in cases in which they had family members, it endangered them as well. But when we're looking at this period of time, what we have to really think about is, okay, so what does it look like from the perspective of women loving women? One of the few instances we have of known women loving women native to Colorado or part of Colorado or who lived here for a long time is the story of Mary Sperry and Gail Laughlin. My friend and historian Wendy Rouse has a forthcoming article talking about these two. Gail Laughlin was a lawyer and Mary Sperry was a doctor. And not only were they likely lesbians, they never married, they shared the same space, they were companions, but they moved here after the Great San Francisco earthquake in terms of Denver, Colorado in 1906. They stayed in Denver until about 1913. While they were here, they were members of the National Women's Party. They were members of the Denver Women's Professional Club, and Laughlin even continued her suffrage activism after she left San Francisco as vice president of the Colorado Equal Suffrage Association. While they were here in Denver, their offices, which were apparently in the same office building at the Kittredge building in downtown Denver, were right around the corner from where we think in the 1910s and 1920s a great deal of queer people were living, in these large single tenement houses, or for women loving women, in large houses in which there were boarding rooms or people could rent or have roommates. So the life way of women loving women in this period of time appears to reveal a couple of different things. Single people, large numbers of them living in cities, created large queer cultures. This is from George Chauncey's thesis in Gay New York. Whatever the case is, with Mary Sperry and Gail Laughlin, we know that they only lived in Denver for a long time, but the evidence of their love comes from the fight over the estate. In 1919, one died in a car crash, and the mother of the one that passed the estate on to the other sued. What ends up happening is that the mother says that they didn't have a legitimate relationship, this person wasn't a legitimate heir, and in the court battle, the mother says they had a deviant relationship. More importantly, they're buried together in Illinois, and they say deep and loving friendship on the headstones. I believe it's in central Illinois near Peoria. Suffice it to say, this is covered in Wendy Rouse's article, but when looking at the story of who these women are and what they were doing in 19-teens and 1920s Denver, they're working with women-loving women in and around the city. They're part of the Equal Suffrage Association, and they're part of the known circles of the powerful women in Colorado, suggesting that if they were recognized as a couple, there were other women around them, but this is worth a lot of further research. So for African-American women, the stories of women-loving women are likely to present, thank you so much for the slide, Kat, I appreciate it, are likely to present much further research. And excuse me for stuttering a little bit, I have done this presentation in a moment. So in Moya Hansen's thesis, Pebbles on the Shore, about the history of 5 Points, she noted a National Urban League, or NUL study, which noted higher numbers of single African-American women in Denver, more so than other counties. They were largely concentrated in the 5 Points neighborhood. Most of these women were employed as domestic servers, domestic service workers, or some of them in the professions like teachers and librarians. Historian Rosalind Terborg Penn's book, which is noted here on the left, notes 4 large African-American voting clubs as a homosocial space for women, or for African-American women in Denver, Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York. These women became the nucleus of the African-American voting bloc in those cities, and in Denver's case met with the likes of Judge Ben Lindsay in 1907, which is just a year after Gail and Mary moved to Denver. And in some of the households, and some of the clubs, they represented about 4,600 to 7,900 African-American women who were registered to vote. The crazy thing is that their percentage of voting was close to the 90th percentile. What that means is that they became the nucleus in their churches, in their communities, of African-American voting bloc within their communities. Now, historians often look at homosocial spaces like a women's club, of which Mary Sperry and Gail Laughlin were a part of, for unmarried women, for women who are involved in deep romantic friendships, or from women who are apparently involved in deep and loving work with other women, like we'll talk about with Jane Addams in Hull House in just a moment. Whatever we see here are those intimate patterns, and those are kind of the big signifiers of intimate patterns, deep and loving friendships, intimate spaces, same-sex social environments, and then working for women's rights, which is why suffrage in America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is such a safe space for women-loving women. It's one of the few spaces that they can access people of like mind. It's one of the few spaces that they can find people who may feel embodied or feel loved the same way that they do. Suffice it to say, what we end up with is a large, hundreds of thousands of these women writing to people like Alice Paul, and this comes from Lillian Faderman's book, What Lesbians Have Done for America, in the National Women's Party, and Paul was involved with a same-sex relationship throughout most of her life, even though I believe she was married. Long story short, they adore her. They adore the leaders of these suffragist movements. And many of these women in Faderman's book, she talks about how they declare their undying affection and love and these deep romantic and sometimes sexual sentiments. So no doubt that these women were obviously leaders in their communities. What we're looking for when we're looking for queer African-American or women-loving women in African-American spaces is likely something similar. And I suspect that when we look at the history of other groups like Latinos, Latinas, and Asian Americans, and many, many different groups, we'll see similar patterns. We'll see individuals navigating spaces reified by race, class, and gender, but yet still finding those same spaces where they can find love, acceptance, and community. And the definition of community being where people come together, they share their common story, they find common bond, and they work towards common goals. Whatever the case is, this is one of the most fruitful areas, I think, for the exploration of women-loving women in Colorado, because I think it's a large homosocial environment. Statistically speaking, there are a few women-loving women within this group, but further research is required. As we see in the current slide, there are 2 people I want to introduce you to. One in the center is Bessie the Girl Hobo, and the other on the far right is Grace Evangelist. Grace is probably one of the few cases I know of a woman-loving woman. Like, she was involved in a same-sex relationship, and Grace presented as Grace, even though Grace presented their gender differently. They never went by a different name. Bessie was taken as a subject in, Bessie was found as the girl hobo tramping across the United States on a railroad train. Bessie was found in Colorado Springs. Bessie was found to be a young woman about 18 or 19 years old, dressing as a man. Bessie said because she felt that it was safer, and tramping, of course, is riding along the railroads to get across from point A to point B. Bessie is an example, as well as Grace, of that late 19th century tradition of taking the criminal or the cross-dresser, exposing them in the public as a problem, and then ire being written up about them. Claire Sears talks a lot more about many, many different examples in her book, Arresting Dress. Long story short, when we look at Bessie's tradition, Bessie is presenting as a male. I am using Bessie here as an example to show the kind of class barriers that women-loving women or people who are gender nonconforming may have faced when they wanted to present their gender as a signifier or do gender illusion as a signifier to attract attention of others. When we look at oral histories from books like Queer Boston or the stories of African-American women-loving women here in the Black Lesbians book, an annotated bibliography by J.R. Roberts, what we find is gender signifiers, gender transgression as a signifier for difference. So in other words, a woman-loving woman starts to dress more masculine, presents butch as is common in more in the middle of the 20th century, and begins to gain like attention of other people. So queer women know that that is a safe person, or that is a person who may feel embodied the same way. With Grace, Grace was arrested for cross-dressing on Manhattan Beach with a woman who was allegedly 72 years old when Grace was supposedly around 24. The details of this always seem a little strange to me because when you read the primary sources, what you find is that Grace was arrested for cross-dressing, but a year later arrested for presenting their gender as male. Grace was arrested in 1907, I believe, and ended up in the middle of downtown Denver right near Union Station. A crowd of people gathered around Grace, and thought that Grace was a woman presenting as a man. And so they got a police officer, there was a medical exam conducted, and Grace was arrested. But after the medical exam, the police officer found out that Grace was indeed a biological woman, and with his apologies, sent on her way. But in the reports, Grace said, "I am just trying to present myself as I am. I've lost my kids, my husband," and she did lose 3 kids because they were taken away from her for cross-dressing. Why don't you just let me be? I like this example because as women-loving women in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, what we find here is that Grace is evidence of Claire Sear's thesis that the anti-cross-dressing laws erase transgender people, cause the public to, or train the public to identify them, and then to report them to authority figures and punish them. We also see people who are viewed as gender nonconforming and gender queer looking like they are more and more wards of the public state, which is what Emily Skidmore talks about in her book, which is that because they are viewed as people who need public aid, they're viewed as problems in society and eventually criminals. And so they're expressed as much again in that cycle of public ire and into public angst and hate. We don't really know what happens to Grace or Bessie, other than the fact that they are mentioned in the newspapers and they disappear from the record there afterwards. But we do have the story of one certain woman-loving woman who presented as male, who may have been a person we identify as transgender or trans male today. The name of this person's given name was Helen Hilscher. And I won't mean to dead name this person or use an anachronism, but I will say that they presented as Jack Hill for most of their lives. So I will choose the name Jack for this person. Jack was born in Denver, Colorado, and according to the vital records, was attended East High School, was the child of folks from the East Coast. Jack's father was a Prussian immigrant, but Jack was also a homesteader on the Eastern Plains near Fort Lupton. And Jack allegedly, according to the newspapers, quote, mashed the heart of local young women in and around the High Plains fort. So one day, Jack comes to Denver to get the homestead license, to secure the homestead and begin farming. And when Jack is in Union Station, Jack has to present as Helen Hilscher. So Jack goes with his friends into the station, changes into a dress, and comes out and presents as Helen Hilscher according to the account. Whatever the case is, the identity is revealed as to be not necessarily what people thought they were, but Jack is run out of Denver, loses their homestead license, and then a year later ends up in Meeker, Colorado doing cooking work. But in this account from Bogue's work, Redressing America's Frontier Past, we find Jack in love with a young woman named Anna Slifka. Anna is a German immigrant. Jack's father was a Prussian immigrant. Anna's brother employed Jack in multiple projects. Anna's brother was apparently a construction worker. Allegedly, Anna's brother thought that Jack was going to skip town, so this brother reported Jack to the police. It was revealed that Jack had formerly been Helen Hilscher of Denver, Colorado. When this was revealed in the newspapers, this account from Denver a year earlier in 1911 came up again. Whatever the case is, Jack wrote to a friend in Denver, one doctor named Mary, who came to Denver, or came from Denver and was not married at the time, and who lived on South Broadway. So whatever the case is, it seems like Jack reached out to a network of friends to come support him. But most of all, when we look at the network of friends, these folks were leaders. When one looks at the vital records for this particular doctor, she lived in a house with another woman on South Broadway, right near where the University of Denver was just newly established. So it suggests she was a powerful person. So between these different stories, what we have are glimpses into women-loving women life in early 20th century Denver. If these doctors were also women-loving women, which is speculative, but possibly based in evidence, and we know from Mary Sperry and Gail Laughlin's that those two moved among the dominant circles of Denver, we can begin to look at those circles and see more and more of this story. In numerous clubs around Denver, however, we have references of the so-called bohemian clubs. So what I take away from these 3 or 4 or 5 examples is that much further research is needing to be done, but we also have the stories of some women-loving women during this period of time. There were class barriers to women-loving women before 1920. There were racial barriers likely, and it was likely that there was more scrutiny for public people, or as I said, and I've given evidence to, women-loving women who transgressed. And yet when we come to the bohemian clubs, we come to an interesting case study from Salt Lake City in 1920, from 1920 to 1930, which moves us into the second period of the Taoiseach History Committee's work, 1920 to 1970. Kat, can we move to the next slide, please? And thank you, my friend. Thank you so much. So in the 1920s, we have scrutiny of women-loving women. What I've presented to you here is a little bit of a trick. I don't know if these were women-loving women, but they are engaging in cross-dressing, which seems to be a signifier of gender and queer differences. In the center is a very searchable photo on the Denver Public Library website for cross-dressing and women's clubs. It almost immediately comes up, and you see 13 or 14 women gathered out near the rocks in the foothills in a park right outside of Denver, and they're engaging in cross-dressing. This could be a form of poking fun at masculinity, but it's all women and they have access to cars, which was a new thing in Colorado at that time. Many of the women's clubs in Colorado specifically started to use their cars to be able to go into rural spaces and to have outdoor like spaces for themselves, which is another vignette you see later on. In the middle, on the far right, you see a giant clipping from, I believe it's the Denver Post, circa 1923. And this is, of course, the quote-unquote bachelor girl. Bachelor girl was a coded word in American press and amongst queer people for women-loving women. Women, in other words, like the female husband, who were never married. And as Jane Addams and the work of women-loving women in the social and settlement house movement allowed women, a whole new generation of women, access to a space that they'd never had before. In effect, as historians say, never having a choice not to marry for the first time in American history. So what ends up happening is that you start to see more scrutiny of these spaces. And Jane Addams was also involved in a same-sex relationship, where she shared intimate houses. She created a safe space for women, but you also start to see more and more scrutiny as the 1920s and 1930s roll into. Examples come from the Harlem Renaissance, and this is a pejorative term used at the time, but the quote bull dagger. the very masculine or center of masculine presenting woman who was a danger to traditional femininity. This is a time when the Ku Klux Klan and racial riots, not unlike with white supremacists coming back to dominance today, were rescinded. You had, in effect, a backlash to a kind of social progressivism in the 1920s. Historians of this period talk about the social movements in the 1920s, about the anti-communist purges, the Red Scares, so on and so forth, left over from World War I. But for women-loving women in Colorado, what we have to look for are these places where you're not just seeing gender illusion, and the Bohemian Club is one place you see it, but you also have to look for homosocial environments. So in numerous clubs around Denver, in the same newspapers, you have, quote, Bohemian clubs that are giving accounts of otherness, racial otherness, Eastern otherness, and the sexualization of racial minorities, particularly women from different cultures. In the newspapers, they talk about how bizarre and strange these are. But when we look back into queer history, we find reference to these bohemian places such as the Pickle Club in Chicago in the early 1920s and early 1900s, and as far back as Paris's Hall in New York in the 1890s. These are places where bohemians, who are a kind of 19th and early 20th century counterculture, express queer desire. They oftentimes have queer spaces, gender illusion, and same-sex desire expressed pretty widely in them. In same-sex dynamics among 19th century Americans, a Mormon example, D. Michael Quinn notes these bohemian clubs in Salt Lake City. And Salt Lake City is, of course, only about 500 or 600 miles away from Denver, Colorado. So it's an analogous geographical comparison, if not a little bit of a different cultural comparison. He noted that in this one study from a lesbian ethnographer working in Salt Lake in the 1920s and 1930s, she noted over 40 different women-loving women, some of whom were involved in polyamorous relationships, some of whom were involved in polygamy. They were sister wives. Some of whom commented on each other's masculinity and femininity and how she assigned them values like if they were more higher feminine presenting, they were more normalized. This one study also notes that there were queer men amongst these same groups as well. So they were involved in what were termed then white marriages, which were marriages which were offering cover, right? So here we have white people in the middle of a city in Utah, and they're practicing in these bohemian clubs white marriages as a form of defensible space. What we end up with in Denver is a likely exploration of similar bohemian clubs, which were located all along 17th Avenue from what was then a dying lower downtown in an industrial district in which you had a large single male population to uptown, sort of where the Brown Palace is today. So it suggests a queer landscape in and around those areas. But we also know that there were famous drag performers like Julian Eltinge who came through Denver between 1905 and 1926, and they performed in these theater venues. And a number of sodomy cases suggest that there were men who were men-loving men or queer men inhabiting those same spaces. It's interesting to think about when we're looking at more homosocial environments outside of these bohemian clubs. We're also going to start likely finding women-loving women in spaces which become more reified, such as the women's softball leagues, which began in the late 19th century, and I'll talk a little bit more about in just a few minutes. Whatever the case is, beyond these white marriages and these defensible spaces, we have in essence a great deal of scrutiny of these different groups. Let me see here. Categorically, what we have are a lot of women who cross-dress. We're also likely transgender men. But when we're looking back at those queer signifiers, we see so many of them concentrated in such an area within just downtown Denver or in and around those central areas. It suggests a queer space in and around the city of Denver. And for women-loving women, this is naturally a space that they would inhabit. The women's clubs of Denver, which Mary Sperry and Gail Laughlin were a part of, met in Capitol Hill, which was just becoming, or in the hotels of downtown Denver. and they were living in what were then the suburbs of the city. So with affluence, they had the ability to buy a townhouse in a newly renovated suburb like Berkeley, because Denver hadn't really, or a neighborhood like Berkeley, which was just incorporated in 1895 into the city and county of Denver. And yet, as we move into the middle period, 1970 or 1920 to 1970, we have a lot of mystery left, with very few references before about the second period of the, before about the Second World War. It was then, as I said, we discovered Katie Gill Martin's work in 2018. Katie, who was then a cultural studies PhD student, was doing interviews of women loving women in 1992 to about 1995. Katie now runs the Queer Ancestors Project in San Francisco, teaching queer artists about queer history. Thank you, I appreciate that, Kat. Katie did, in effect, something like 35 to 48 of these oral histories of women loving women. In these stories, we have some of the most beautiful and greatest evidence of the history of women loving women in Colorado. But the difference of these stories is that these are women who identify as women loving women or self-identified lesbians. Some of them were out, some of them were bisexual, some of them were married at some point. But by the time these interviews were done, these women had lived lives for decades as women loving women, as lesbians. So we certainly see and can intimate that after World War II and after the 1930s, a lesbian consciousness, as Lillian Faderman talks about in her book, emerged in the nation, or a consciousness about an identity, right? One was calling oneself a lesbian. One was calling oneself queer. One was calling oneself by a different name, even though that kind of consciousness had been resplendent and come and gone amongst different people. By the middle of World War II, certainly queer communities had emerged in the United States. Queer historians talk about the emergence of queer communities in cities across the country from about World War, or the late 19th century to about World War II, but the solidification of them around an identity certainly after World War II, once the laws started to get worse and worse for gay men particularly, you started to have more and more identity around the thing which people were being persecuted. Suffice it to say, in the stories of Katie Gill Martin, what we have, and Katie Gill Martin's thesis is called The Very House of Difference. We have stories of middle-class women, African-American women, Chicana women, Native American women, wealthy people, upper-class people, working-class people. And so in this story, race, class, gender, and sexuality are all intertwined into many, many different identities. She writes that with these different identities, there was further geographical complication to the idea of community. In other words, there were many communities. Many of these women lived in cities like Colorado Springs or Fort Collins, and they traveled to Denver, and they referenced Denver as a more safe, if not grittier space, right? But many of the women that Katie interviewed who lived in Colorado Springs were also women who were professional. They had college educations. They were athletes. They worked in sometimes manufacturing jobs. But they also loved, some of them, the privacy that they could have. In other words, being out or being out and proud was a thing to be not only feared, but uncomfortable. Among these women, though, and you can find these oral histories at the Archive of Lesbian Oral Testimony, based in Canada, in Vancouver, I believe, or contact us at the end and we can provide you sources. And the idea of these women loving women becomes complicated from many, many, many different regards. Kathleen Word, who works with us on the Taoiseach History Committee, has spent, actually, could you go back one real quick for me? Kat? Thank you so much. I'm just going to go on another moment and talk about some of these stories. So Kat Ward, who works with us on the Taoiseach History Committee, and Kat herself has worked on these oral histories. And what we found is that some of these women, including a woman named PJ, spoke about being in Denver in the first part of World War II. PJ was from Oklahoma, served in the Air Force, and witnessed women in the middle of the McCarthy period being kicked out of the service, and she worked at Lowry Air Force Base from 1949 to 1953. She noted finding women loving women in softball leagues, as well as women loving women in some bars. Scholarship on women-loving women in the military, such as Susan K. Kahn's From the Muscle Mall to the Butch Player, Mannishness, Lesbianism, and Homophobia in U.S. Women's Sport, note that these clubs, as I said, formed in the early 20th century, but it's one of the greatest signifiers of women-loving women is that we have lesbian softball, and we know that it's a great place to begin to look and to explore as we go throughout these stories. Other storytellers in Gilmartin's series note that one in particular named Virginia Garcia, who was born in 1931 in West Denver, she grew up and noted that her mother taught them to speak English and, quote, act American, as many first-generation people were taught to do. She said that in this interview, I knew I was not dirty, and that she grew up, when she was growing up, she had a gay aunt and uncle who acted as caretakers after her father died and her older siblings moved away. The aunt and uncle were involved in a quote-unquote biker club. The crazy thing is that if we have a gay older aunt and uncle and they're in a biker club, that's a more usual way for us to find women-loving women. She noticed she was also treated differently growing up because she was a girl. She was treated unequally because men were allowed access to privileges like getting drunk or not choosing to go to church. Virginia was also teased by younger boys to the point that she started presenting herself as Robert in order to escape their persecution. Virginia ran away a lot and was caught and engaged as Robert on the streets and picked up and got to know a lot of the neighborhood women, neighborhood girls. She was eventually forced in 1949 to go to a reformatory school, and in the home for girls would pair off and become romantic partners. Gilmartin attributes this to the homosocial nature of the space, but suffice it to say in 1953, she mentions that there were nuns within the reformatory school who were also women-loving women or lesbians. It suggests that the nuns' intention was to help these young women in some regards, which is another signifier of a women-loving women's space, is the want to work towards helping other women. In 1953, as she listed in the Navy and was caught in the butch femme culture, and she was quote unquote outed, even though she was in a relationship with a man. She spoke about the military purges and that it drove women-loving women in the military to form cliques and to become very tight. And that if one person betrayed another, it was known who the betrayer was. So there were deep levels of close confidence. Yet in the middle of this persecution, she found others who felt like her and returned to Denver, and many of them lived here. She experimented both with being butch and femme in the 1950s and 1960s, and Garcia noted that as a queer Latina, she saw a lot of Hispanic lesbians who had to deal with a, quote, lot more self-hatred because of the Catholic structure and the machismo qualities, she says, which circumscribe Chicano men or Latino men. Other stories reveal class conflicts and some don't. Colorado for women-loving women was not as easy to navigate as other spaces. Gilmartin notes in some of these stories that one in particular who worked at the Broadmoor Hotel, she would have private parties with her girlfriends, and as I said earlier, came to Denver. And yet another African-American woman-loving woman in Denver noted that she could navigate freely amongst the mixed bars, racially mixed bars and class mixed bars of 5 Points, which is also where the bohemians and the and people like Allen Ginsberg would go to when they were living in Capitol Hill and going to these nightclubs like the Rainbow Room on Broadway. But these were African-American spaces of people of color, even though I don't like to use that term. But they were places where people could just kind of be who they were without the scrutiny that one would find in more formal bars. So it suggests that the relationship between queer discrimination and queer presentation is a function of classism, right? That there's class scrutiny for gender nonconforming people. There's class scrutiny for racial integration or for different people from many different groups interacting together. Into the 1960s, this same author noted that it was because she was African American and she had access to these spaces that it was no big deal. And she was working class for most of her life. But that it was the upper class white lesbians that had the race problem, not her. Into the 1960s, transgender women, or self-described cross-dressers, in fact, who had wives, and so I will pull into the discussion of women-loving women, created a bar on the Auraria campus called the Gilded Cage. Many of these women were cross-dressers then, but transitioned to women, to transgender women later on. The same group corresponded with Virginia Prince, who formed the first magazine for trans women by trans women called Transvestia in 1964-1965. One of the interesting things is that, again, these trans women had privilege. They had their own private spaces. And over the course of 10 years, from 1964 to 1974, they created cross-dresser support groups out of spaces like the Gilded Cage, which didn't last long because of the urban renewal or the tearing down of the Auraria campus. And they started to rent hotel rooms and present as female in public with their wives. One of the more interesting aspects of this is that it suggests that there's another race class division here as well. In 1968, of course, we also have the Daughters of Bilitis, who were created by Phyllis I'm going to take a breath. Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, God rest their souls. They had a conference here in 1968. And in the records in the LGBT Historical Society in San Francisco, they note about coming to Denver and meeting with this kind of militant community that was just beginning to come out and into their own. People who grew up here, women-loving women, lesbians, who identify the culture and grew up in the culture in the 1950s and 60s, note that Denver was a fairly progressive town. And yet they also note that Denver was what they called racist, was a closet racist town. It was a closet classist town. That as long as you didn't rock the boat, you didn't get in trouble. And that was the detente in the cultural war for decades and decades and decades. Denver may be in denial about its own history of racism, which is a poignant thing, I think, to bring up today. That while we have progressive roots, we also have racist roots. The Ku Klux Klan ruled in Colorado for almost 10 years, between about 1924 and 1928. They had every level of state government. And without the general support of the Colorado community, and without the resistance of multiracial people, including probably queer people, that would not have ended for some time. Suffice it to say, when you look ahead 50 years and you look at the race-class tensions within the queer community, it's also worth further exploration from African-American woman-loving woman perspective, from a transgender woman perspective, to look at the different tensions. Into the 1960s, in fact, and towards the end of the 1970s, queer militantism in the United States and in Colorado was viewed as something which was simmering and brewing and rising with the anti-war movement. We know that there were people after the Denver Area Madison Society in 1959 who carried on for some time, and I must be running a little low on time. But suffice it to say, to characterize the history of women-loving women at the end of the 1960s is to say that it was a community or part of a growing queer community that was ready for transformation, and ready for militancy. May we move on to the next one, please, and thank you. Thank you so much, Kat. I appreciate it. So when we get to the 1970s, which is the third period in the Taoiseach History Committee's study, and I'm not doing justice to this cohesive narrative, but I am saying that there are a ton more questions that I can get to in just a few minutes. We see queer militantism in the gay liberation fronts all across Front Range, Colorado. Gay liberation fronts proliferated after Stonewall in 1969 and were named deliberately in some cases after the Vietnamese Liberation Front or others. And there were at least 5 in Colorado, in Denver, Boulder, Colorado College, Fort Collins, and then in Colorado Springs. I'm sorry, in 4 of them, Boulder, Fort Collins, Denver, and Colorado Springs. And they were based mostly at the colleges. The one in Denver appears to have been more short-lived, from about 1970 to 71, but most of them had gay male founders, but many of them had women-loving women. And yet in the middle of all the 1970s, people who grew up then note that this women-loving women institution or culture, which was about to change and about to engage in a lot of different work, started to create separate spaces for themselves. So many of the oral histories done by this historian note the Big Mama Rag. Big Mama Rag, on the right hand of this slide, was a lesbian feminist newspaper founded, I believe, in 1972, went to 1984. Right now, the Taoiseach History Committee is working with members of this group, Big Mama Raggers, as they call themselves, and veterans and the founding mothers, to record their stories on top of what historian and teacher Amy Lilly has already done in the past couple of years. But amongst this collective, you find other spaces for women loving women. The Woman to Woman bookstore, the Women's Outdoor Club, the women's bars like the Three Sisters and the Velvet Hammer. You also start to see the story of women loving women in Colorado not just become more militant, but much more intersectional, right? It becomes about women. And it doesn't just become about women loving women, but they start to publish in Big Mama Rag the stories of mothers, of women of color, of women in the third world, of women who are in colonized and oppressed countries, and what people can do, women to communicate and to help educate and to help fight for their rights as well, to bring attention to a lot of stories of women loving women in the 1970s. What we also start to see are correspondences with women in prison. Amongst the long run of Big Mama Rag, and you can go to the History Project website or just Google Big Mama Rag, and you can read all of the BMR copies online. They engage in dialogue with women who don't have lawyers, women who are mothers, women who are Latina, thank you, women who are experiencing discrimination on a grand scale. And women loving women also started to create spaces for themselves. The thing about the BMR is that they end up winning a Supreme Court case in 1984, establishing the right for them to be identified and get nonprofit status for their postage. It took the last 6 years of the BMR to get that, but it was a major breakthrough. The same culture of women loving women in the 1970s started to hold rallies for lesbians and for feminist rights in downtown Denver. They had a music festival. Our own local band called Sweet Honey by Judith Blair was formed here in Denver and Boulder, actually, and they signed with Olivia Records. We have pictures from Jackie St. Joan of women loving women at the first Women's Music Festival at East High School in 1974, which is only 10 months after, or 2 months after the first gay-in at Cheeseman Park. What ends up happening here is you see the proliferation of women loving women in the 1970s and 1980s. It was, as one activist said, a flourishing time, a time when we came together and a time when we found love. One of the first poets to write this about this period was Chocolate Waters. She wrote a story, a book of poetry called To the Man Reporter from the Denver Post, because a Denver Post reporter had come and wrote a really nasty article about them. She says in this poem, "I knew from the start it was a mistake to talk to you. 6 radical feminists against the man of the press and high frightened photographer with the evil eye. You expected us to be reasonable, to defer to you as a man and a member of the almighty male media, to explain our position logically, to smile a lot. After all, we are living in a civilized world." She goes on to say at the end of this stuff, "No, Mr. Man Reporter, we didn't have trouble defining a women's culture. You had trouble understanding it. A women's culture, a women's civilization, a world where war doesn't rip the earth apart in 100 different places every year because the boys are busy playing with their army trucks. A world without obscene telephone callers. A world where people don't go to prison because they're poor and their name isn't Richard Nixon. A whole world, a real world that could be run on the values of women in touch with ourselves and our power as women. But power scares you because you only know one way to use it, and that's your way. So you're afraid of us together, afraid you will be shot in the head, afraid you will be ridiculed daily, afraid that you will have to scramble for someone's supper, afraid that you will be murdered with a broom handle. And yes, right now we are unreasonable. We are so unreasonable that we are so perfectly reasonably unreasonable." In this statement, what we find is all of the persecution and all of the double standards about women loving women in that period of time. I'd like to begin to end this presentation by talking a little bit about the period after 1980 and 1985 and 1990. Carol Lease, who was the first woman-loving woman to run as a coordinator for the Center on Colfax, was arrested during a drag show because she tried to prevent a police officer, or she tried to talk to a police officer about why he was arresting a person who was not wearing 3 pieces of drag or something like that. It was a major debacle for her. It was awful. In the middle of all that, lesbian mothers were involved in high-profile cases where they lost their children. In one case in particular, in 1984, a lesbian mother not only lost her children, and upon appeal, the judge said that as a lesbian, she had no rights. There were tons of battles that the women of BMR, that the women at the Women for Women bookstore, fought. They did fundraisers for these mothers and for their sisters. They opened up dialogue and voices for women of color. They opened up dialogue and voices for women who were in prison through correspondence. It's simply by talking to each other, they opened up a space where the wider world could see. On the far left, you see the Equal Protection Ordinance Coalition of Denver. And the reason that I chose the name Taoiseach History Committee is in honor of Taoiseach, who was not simply the first woman to run openly as governor in Colorado, to draw attention, among other things, for the anti-discrimination ordinance she helped found, but for the lifelong work that she inspires in other people. When we look back at people like Mary Celeste or Taoiseach or others who have spent their lives fighting for the rights of women-loving women, we also look to sisters in the past. We look to women-loving women like Mary and Gail, or we look to the women of Katie Gilmartin's oral histories. We look to the women in the suffragist movement 100 years ago, who were not simply fighting for women to have the right to vote, but for women to have access to education and healthcare. And they weren't simply fighting for the rights of women, they were fighting for the rights of all oppressed peoples. Many of the leaders, in fact, most of the leaders, including Alice Paul, went on to found the international peace movement in the middle of the 1950s and 1960s. And in their incredibly long lives, they did more to achieve in what most, for generations of people, what most of us could dream of. And that's the tradition that women-loving women in Colorado have followed. And while I have not done justice to the stories, and I fumbled a lot during this presentation, that is the one vignette in this story which I take away. If we look at the story of women-loving women, you see 5 women-loving women on the right who are now representatives in the Colorado State Assembly. You may know their faces, you may know their stories, but what we all know are their hearts. And so lastly, in the tradition of women-loving women, we have to talk about what are the problems we still have to face. Women-loving women still having access to healthcare. Women of color not being brutalized by police. In fact, all African-American people, which is what these protests and what the contemporary movements about the murder of George Floyd are about. You see, it's in the greatest of American traditions that we follow the saying, e pluribus unum, right? But our greatest destiny is not simply the separate individualism which we uphold, but our diversity. Diversity is the greatest strength of the American people, and perhaps of humanity. It's our ability to come together, overcome our differences, and work towards common goals to build community. In the face of all of these different challenges, across all of these different generations, across all of these different stories, both told, untold, and unknown, the farthest thing from our minds must not be that this is a distant past recreating itself today, but we are following in the tradition of people who fought for our rights long before we were born. and that we are doing the same for those who come after us. And we must dream of that world where we are no longer judged for who we love, but how. And more importantly, where we all truly are treated equally before the law, as much as who we are as people. So at the end of this, we see the rise and the prominence of women-loving women in Colorado, and yet still so much work to do. We see women-loving women in all aspects of government, and women-loving women in several other, and I'm running out of time, I'm sorry guys. I'm gonna cut my expatiation there and then just open it up for questions. But that is the one thing I want you all to take away, is that it's a long story and we haven't got even the tip of the iceberg yet.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much for being here today again and for rounding out our the presentation today with the recognition that something significant about this work is how we can use it to examine the parallels we still experience today and how we continue to combat systems of injustice. We can take just a couple of moments. We want to be respectful of everyone's time to answer a question here. It looks like we have one in our Q&A. Mike, am I able to pass it to you to take a look at the question I see that might be in our Q&A?
Yeah, sure. So it's simply just wondering if we could provide information on all the books and resources that David had mentioned. So whether that's easy enough, that was a lot in there. I can definitely send that up in a follow-up email, but if David, if you have anything you'd like to drop in the chat, that is what the inquiry is about.
Yeah, the very first one I'm gonna recommend is Lillian Faderman. You can just Google her. And the book is called What Lesbians Have Done for America, I believe. That was written in response to in the time of 2004 when the Bush administration was going to war in Iraq. And it is a phenomenal, stunning book. You will read, it blew my mind. I read the thing front to cover in 2 weeks and I did not know, or it was never told to me, that many of the leaders of the suffragist movement were women-loving women. I was frankly surprised, which doesn't happen much, so.
Great. Yeah, we will be sure to share a list of resources as well as information on other events and things that we'll be doing at the Center for Colorado Women's History that we encourage you all to join us for. I'll pause for just a moment, just in case anyone else has questions to come into our chat. I see Steve has asked, thank you, Steve. Are there specific laws in Colorado today that still discriminate against LGBTQ+ folks?
That would be a question for One Colorado. There are a number of laws that I'm aware of historically that they fought to overturn, such as the anti-cross-dressing law, and that was overturned in 1974. A lot of the laws that were still discriminatory against, yeah, in fact, there is one. Amendment 2 is still on the books. Like slavery is still part of many state constitutions. It's a remnant, even though it was struck down by the Supreme Court. Its language has never been struck from the Colorado Constitution, which is long. I unfortunately don't know if I know the answer to that question. I can only speculate. I would say that a better resource would be One Colorado, specifically contacting their information page.
Great. Yeah, One Colorado also has continual information on current legislation, work that's being done, and they also publish annual reports on the state of LGBTQ experience throughout the state. So definitely a wonderful resource. Right. To
one last comment, actually.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, the one thing that may be of use for this is that these stories are not currently taught in public schools. So kids don't have access to this information. You have to really dig for this. That's something that the Colorado state government is working to fit now. But I would think that's another topic for another.
Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us today. In the interest of time, I think we'll go ahead and conclude. We want to thank so much David for being here. Please look for information in our upcoming emails, both about resources from the talk today and about other work that the Center for Colorado Women's History is participating in. We do have some upcoming lectures and information we'd like to invite you to, including a 2-hour workshop in a couple of weeks where we invite members of our queer community to write about queer history, beauty, power, resistance, and identity. So we'll include information about that as well. There are some other events being put in our chat here. And we want to thank everyone for coming out to support today and encourage us to continue to support our community, including Black Lives Matter, who we stand in solidarity with, and continue to all do this work together.